There's a pandemic going on. It's infecting our cities, our politics, and our workplaces. Young people as well as the elderly. No, I'm not talking about COVID. I'm talking about loneliness. According to economist Norina Hertz, we're living in the lonely century. She's condensed years of research into her new book and hopes that global leaders will take note of the severity of the situation.
And what I realised very quickly was that we were in the midst of a global loneliness crisis, with 1 in 5 adults feeling lonely, always or often.
And this is despite technology making it as easy to talk to our neighbours as it is to talk to someone on the other side of the world. Should loneliness be put on the agenda and recognised for what it is? Something with huge economic, societal and political consequences.
I kind of wanted to target it as almost like an Uber, but for friends versus cars.
Do the rent-a-friend businesses springing up have the right idea? Or does the solution lie in structural change to our cities, our workplaces, and indeed our whole lives? Hello, I'm Dermot Murnaghan, and welcome to the Sky News Daily Podcast.
Well, it was really 3 things that happened at roughly the same time. The first was my students. I was teaching at university and I observed that really significant numbers of students were coming into my office and in office hours confiding in me that they felt lonely and isolated. And this was a pretty new phenomenon. I'd been teaching on and off at university for about 20 years and I had never seen this scale, this number of students feeling lonely and isolated.
Norina Hertz is an economist and author. She's advised companies and governments and is an honorary professor at the Institute of Global Prosperity in London.
In my academic research, I was researching the rise of right-wing populism across the globe. Leaders like Donald Trump in the United States, Marine Le Pen in France, Matteo Salvini in Italy. And as I interviewed people who were voting for right-wing populists, one thing that came across from their stories time and time again was how lonely and isolated they were. Lonely in the sense of not having friends and having limited support networks, but also lonely in the sense of feeling unseen, unheard, and invisible, which is a key element of what loneliness, of course, is as well. So there I had my students feeling lonely, in my research, right-wing populist voters feeling lonely, and I had bought an Alexa, one of those Amazon devices, AI virtual assistant devices that sits in my kitchen. And I observed how I was interacting with her and how attached I was becoming to this little device in my kitchen, which got me thinking about what I came to define as the loneliness economy, an entire economy made up of goods and services being designed to alleviate loneliness, of which virtual assistants, and deliver companionship, of which virtual assistants are but one. Which made me also think, well, the market is speaking here. Clearly there's a demand for such products because there's a lot of innovation happening on that front. So this got me thinking, what is going on here? And I started really digging into the subject. And what I realized very quickly was that we were in the midst of a global loneliness crisis, with 1 in 5 adults feeling lonely, always or often. This is before the pandemic even. 1 in 5 millennials saying that they didn't have a single friend at all. Shocking. 2 in 5 pensioners saying that their main form of company was a television or their pet. And I thought, I have to understand this subject. I have to understand how we got here. And then, of course, importantly, what we can do about it. And then, of course, the pandemic really ramped everything up. And today, around 50% of the population in recent surveys are feeling, on average, lonely. I mean, that is shocking.
I mean, just to continue with that issue of the lockdowns and the effect on loneliness, and you mentioned then the link with populist parties, some of them extremist. During the lockdowns, the polling seems to tell us, though, that populations are becoming more trusting in the establishment, perhaps because they're fearful, and in actual fact sometimes feeling if they have criticisms of their administrations, of their governments, they are because they're not taking extreme enough measures to protect them. Do you think that will, in a way, yes, it's driving loneliness, but push people back away from those populist parties?
Well, some populist parties, of course, or quasi-populist parties, are in power in many countries. And what we're actually seeing more recently over the last few weeks is in France, for example, Marine Le Pen polling very strongly in France. We're seeing in Germany at local levels, Alternative for Deutschland actually polling very high again. So I think that it makes sense and it fits with all my research that a considerable part of the population who feels lonelier today, who feels particularly unseen, unheard, and invisible, is looking for politicians who speak directly to that. And it has been right-wing populists who have done so. Of course, often inflaming the group who they're speaking to by highlighting how different they are to the other who are demonized. And one thing actually fascinating in research with mice, what the researchers found was that the longer a mouse was isolated and kept in a cage, the more violently it attacked a new mouse when it was put into its cage. And that's really of mice of men. That's the danger, that this extended period of isolation will make certain groups of people lash out even more against those they perceive as other, and politicians who inflame that may do well as a result.
Talk to me about your thesis about how loneliness is bad for business. You mentioned there you talking to your virtual assistant, your Alexa. No doubt it's harvesting all your data and designing products to sell you on the basis of your interactions. Why is loneliness bad for business then?
So it's an opportunity for some kinds of businesses, businesses that are innovating and creating products designed to alleviate loneliness and deliver connection. So really over the coming couple of years, I think we're going to see a real rise in an appetite for co-working spaces, co-living spaces, shared experiences that people can do together, as well as for devices and technology-enabled devices and robots designed to alleviate loneliness and deliver connection. But it's bad for businesses in the sense that lonely workers are bad for business, because lonely workers, we know, are less productive, they're less motivated, they're less engaged with their job. If you don't have a friend at work, you are 7 times less likely to be engaged with your job than if you do have a friend at work. And we know that even before the pandemic, 40% of workers were lonely, but during the pandemic, we're seeing rising levels of loneliness amongst workers as they're working from home. So loneliness really is a very significant business issue that is barely on most companies' radars.
What about the geography, the so-called built environment? There is this, and I mean, it's oft been remarked on, there is this conundrum, isn't there, that in the teeming cities of the world, people crammed in together, yet the people in them, in some cases, seem to be lonelier than ever.
Yes. In London, for example, 56% of Londoners, even before the pandemic, said that they felt lonely. It makes sense. If you think about cities, people, full of people rushing, racing, moving fast by each other. I went, as part of my research, I went and stood at Euston Station and just counted the number of people who walked by without even looking at me. 50. After 50, I just stopped counting. And that's what cities are like. In fact, the richer a city, the faster its citizens walk, which I find fascinating. And the denser a city, the less civil its citizens are. So cities, are not the mindset of the city dweller, is typically one which is faster paced, more craving of anonymity, which of course has an upside as well, but also has a downside in that in cities you're less likely to know your neighbors, less likely to even know their names. So more likely to feel lonely.
I'm so interested in that. You standing at Euston Station trying to have eye contact with busy commuters. So, I mean, just in terms of the skill set, your expertise, what you've brought to this book is, of course, your economics background. We've discussed that, but part sociology as well, and just human being.
Yes, and actually, when I was writing The Lonely Century, one of the things I did was I really went around the world and also experienced products of loneliness as well as met lonely people. And one of the interesting things I did was I discovered that you could rent friends. And when I was in New York, I rented a friend, Brittany. I was a bit worried, Dermot. I didn't know, was this something untoward that I was getting involved with? But no, it wasn't. I rented her. We met downtown Manhattan in a coffee shop. We drank matcha tea together. We went to a bookshop together. We went to a clothes shop, Urban Outfitters. We tried on hats and sunglasses. Obviously, it wasn't like being with an old friend, but it was like, when you meet someone new and you're kind of gelling with them and it's really fun. She was great company. She was really interested in everything I was saying. She was laughing at all my jokes. I mean, of course she was, because I was paying her, but
How much? How much an hour?
I was paying $40 an hour, and we're standing in Urban Outfitters having this great time, and she turns around to me and she says, "That'll be $120 times up." What was interesting was I said, "Who is hiring you?" And she said, "Typically 30 to 40-year-old professionals, women as well as men, people who've moved to the city, working very long hours, people in finance, technology, and consulting primarily, don't have time to make friends, don't have a support network, and want someone to have a coffee with, or go to a movie with, or go to a walk in the park with." And it's another fascinating example of how the market was stepping in. There are 620,000 friends to rent on the site that I found her, and yet also a damning condemnation of the kind of world we've built.
It's funny Norina should have mentioned her experience renting a friend, because coming up we have the founder of rentafriend.com to tell us exactly where the idea came from. Plus, could investment in public libraries hold the key to solving loneliness?
Hello, my name is Scott Rosenbaum. I'm the owner of rentafriend.com. I live in New Jersey. I'm born and raised here, and I started Rent a Friend back in 2009, I believe. The way it originally came about was I saw an article about a website, I think it was in Japan or China, about a company that was renting out families. And it immediately piqued my interest. I said, why would they want to rent out families for? Well, it turns out in their society there, it's very important to be seen as a whole family. So if there's a divorce or death in the family, and perhaps a child has a school activity, they could rent a father or mother so that they're seen as a whole family. And that's what originally sparked the idea. Now here in America, unfortunately, divorce is extremely common. So I knew that wouldn't be a reason, but I thought maybe people would be interested in hiring a friend or renting a friend for all different types of platonic reasons. It was a challenge. It was a brand new concept. No one ever heard of Rent a Friend before, especially here in the States. I kind of wanted to target it as almost like an Uber type system, but for friends versus cars. Almost like a dating website, but not for dating. I wanted Rent a Friend to be the 100% complete opposite of that. So a dating website without dating, strictly for friends only. So there's a lot of people, myself included, that are sometimes have anxiety when meeting new people. I know it's hard for me to walk into a room and start conversations with people. And I know a lot of people are like that. So what's great about Rent a Friend is you could find someone that could help you break the ice, that could help you to introduce you to new people, to make social interactions a little less awkward. We've gotten amazing feedback over the years. The site's kind of morphed itself into its own little, I guess, niche world. When I started the website, I assumed it would mostly be men looking for females to go out to dinner with or go out to a movie with. And I was completely blown away by how it really wasn't that. It was a lot of female members that they might have a invitation for work, a work event or a wedding to go to, and don't have anyone to go with. So they could find a platonic friend to just go with them. So I think it's an amazing solution and amazing site for people that are in, I guess, sticky situations. We have a whole list of safety rules. It's very important to always meet in public areas only, never go to anywhere private, make sure you have your own form of transportation, and just, be kind and have a good time with it. I think it's an amazing site that could really help people meet new people and help solve loneliness issues, especially with COVID. That, the past year, it's been rough for a lot of people, and myself included in that. I only rented a friend once, and it's a funny situation. My wife was about to give birth, and I had an interview for a major news station, and I hired a friend to fill in for me to do the interview because my wife was giving birth and I couldn't obviously leave her. So I went on to Rent a Friend to New York, and I looked for a gentleman probably in his late 40s, early 50s, and he looked very professional. I gave him a quick 30-minute rundown on how the website works, and he went on live television as the vice president of Rent a Friend and gave the interview for me.
So this clearly has implications for policymakers. Do you think they actually do care about this? And obviously you think they should. Do you have any kind of remedies for them to suggest to them?
When it comes to governments, there's a lot that they can do. Just to speak to a couple of things. First, what we've seen really across the globe since 2008 has been a steady defunding of what we might think of as the infrastructure of community, of public libraries, of public parks, of daycare centres, of youth clubs, of elderly care centres. People need physical spaces where they can be together and do things together if they are to feel more connected to each other and less alone. And so as a matter of urgency, we need to refund the infrastructure of community. In the United Kingdom, in 2019 alone, 130 public libraries were closed down. So that's a no-brainer, and that's an obvious first step. And another step is definitely to acknowledge the role that social media has played in today's loneliness epidemic. It's not the only driver, there are many drivers, but it's definitely one, and the evidence now is clear on this and unambiguous. So governments can and need to step in here, and the new online safety bill that's just been drafted in the United Kingdom is actually a positive step in this direction, where there'll be a much more significant duty of care imposed on social media companies when it comes to, not harming people, especially children. So that's a positive step in the right direction. That we need to think very carefully now about how we regenerate our local neighborhoods and our local high streets, redressing the imbalance between e-tailers, between companies that sell their goods online and brick and mortar stores needs to be done. There is clearly an issue and a growing issue of empty shops in high streets. And this is something where other governments have intervened successfully. In Belgium, for example, there's a tax, an empty shop tax, which disincentivizes landlords from keeping shops empty for protracted periods because a tax is imposed. And even when we're thinking about regenerating social housing, there are things and lessons we can learn from elsewhere. In Chicago, for example, there was a great scheme whereby new public housing blocks were built with branches of the Chicago Public Library on the ground floor, creating hubs for the residents, but also creating a space for locals in the area who might have thought otherwise, not in my backyard, actually creating a reason for them to go to that place and interact with residents. So lots and lots that governments can do if the will is there.
In 2018, the UK government created the world's first Minister for Loneliness, along with publishing a strategy and releasing funding for tackling the issue. Further funding was announced by the Culture Secretary last year as the UK was plunged into a lockdown. But it seems from talking to Norina that loneliness will be an issue long after the last COVID restrictions are lifted. Well, thank you to Norina and Scott, and thank you too for listening to another episode of the Sky News Daily podcast. This episode was produced by Lauren Pinkney and Kat Suave. To get more interviews like this, do head over to our website and app and check out our other podcasts.